There is a version of this story where the monsters come from the outside, where they fall from the sky, or crawl from a pit, or are sent by a god with an agenda. That version is comfortable. You can close a door against it. You can build a wall, or pray the right prayer, or make the right sacrifice. That version gives you a fighting chance. This is not that version. The entities at the center of this story were not sent. They were not created. They were not imagined by frightened people staring at the dark. They were generated by the universe itself in the first seconds after the first unforgivable act, as an automatic and irreversible response. They are not punishment in the way a whip is punishment. They are punishment in the way a fever is punishment. They are the immune system of reality, and they are already inside you. The only question, the one that will haunt every moment of what follows, is whether you have done something to make them wake up. Before we can understand what the Erinyes are, we have to go back to the moment reality broke for the first time. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, back to the actual rupture. The wound in the sky from which they were born. In the beginning, before Zeus, before Olympus, before anything the Greeks would have called a god in the sense we mean today, there was Uranus, the sky. And beneath him, saturating everything, was Gaia, the earth. He pressed himself down upon her constantly, relentlessly, an infinite weight of cold atmosphere on warm, living soil. Their children, the Titans, were monstrous and numerous. Uranus hated them all. Every time Gaia brought a child into being, Uranus drove it back down into her body and sealed it there, inside the darkness of the earth, buried in the mother who had made them. He did this because something in him recognized that his children would eventually destroy him. He was right. He was just too arrogant to stop. Gaia conspired with her son Cronus. She forged a weapon from gray flint, a sickle with jagged teeth, ancient and cold, and she put it into his hands in the dark. And when Uranus descended upon her one final time, wrapped in the total darkness of night, Cronus reached up from his hiding place and cut off his father's genitals. He threw them into the sea. The waves churned white around the wound, and from that froth, eventually, Aphrodite would rise, the goddess of love and desire born from the severed sex of the sky. The Greeks had a particular genius for making beauty emerge from brutality. But Hesiod, the poet who documented this in the Theogony around 700 BCE, is very specific about what happened to the blood. Not the flesh, the blood. The drops of sky blood that fell downward, pulled by weight, and struck the ancient earth below. Those drops, Hesiod says, Gaia absorbed. She took them into herself, and the seasons moved, and from that absorbed blood, the earth bore the Erinyes. Let that sit for a moment. Let the mechanism register. They were not born. They were grown. From blood. From the specific biological material of paternal violence, sky blood hitting earth flesh, absorbed into the oldest body in existence and incubated across seasons like a slow infection developing in the dark. Their birth is not a dramatic eruption from the underworld. It is a silent, organic germination beneath the surface of reality. It is the quiet, terrible patience of something that was always going to emerge. You would not have seen it happening. You would only have known it was complete when the ground opened and they were already there, already hunting. This is the origin the research makes clear, and it is the origin that changes everything about how we understand them. The Erinyes are not younger than the universe. They are not a feature added later. They are woven into the foundation. They predate Zeus by eons. They predate Olympus. They predate mercy. They predate any legal concept that might soften a verdict or commute a sentence. They are the hardwired response of an cosmos that experienced its first trauma before it was fully formed, and that has never, not once, in all the centuries that followed, recovered. Because they were generated by blood trauma written into the fabric of reality, they are also free from the authority of anyone who came later. Zeus cannot override them. Apollo cannot abolish them. Athena, the goddess of wisdom herself, will eventually try to domesticate them. And the story of how that goes, and what it reveals about the world we live in now, is where this account is building. But that comes later. For now, understand only this. The oldest law in existence is not written in stone. It is not carved on a tablet. It is dissolved into the composition of matter itself. Kill your own blood, and the ground beneath your feet already knows. The earth was there when it was born. It remembers everything. What exactly was born from that blood? Hesiod documents 3 categories of entities from the same catastrophic wound. The giants, physical monstrosities of brute terrestrial violence. The Meliae, the ash tree nymphs, whose timber would eventually be carved into the first war spears. And the Erinyes. Each represents a different consequence of the same trauma. The giants are the kinetic consequence, violence breeding into the earth as brute force. The Meliae are the material consequence, trauma turning to wood, turning to weapons. And the Erinyes are the psychological consequence, the one that lives inside the offender and eats them from the center outward. The Greeks understood something that modern trauma medicine has only recently begun to systematically articulate: that the most devastating damage from violence is not the wound to the victim, it is the wound to the perpetrator. The crack that opens in the floor of the guilty mind, and the things that begin crawling up through that crack in the dark. There is something else buried in Hesiod's account, something that every researcher who summarizes this myth tends to skip past, and it is the detail that changes the nature of what these entities are entirely. The blood that fell was not just any blood. It was the blood of a father, spilled by a son. The blood of the generative power of the sky, falling onto the generative body of the earth. It was blood from the specific act of familial violation, the wounding of the origin, the attack on the source. The Erinyes did not emerge from murder in general. They emerged from a specific category of murder, the category that strikes at the continuity of existence itself. That specificity is not incidental. It is their entire operating code. Which brings us to the question no summary ever stays with long enough. What exactly do they do once they wake up? What does it look and feel and smell like to be hunted by entities that are not chasing you across a physical landscape, but are dissolving into the architecture of your own nervous system and operating from the inside? The answer to that question requires us to meet them individually. And what you will find when you look closely at who they are and what their names actually mean in the Greek is that you are not looking at 3 monsters. You are looking at a clinical map, a precise sequential diagram of a human mind coming completely apart. The ancient Greeks did not invent the Erinyes. They observed them, renamed them, and gave them faces. There is a sound that comes before the Furies arrive. Not a roar, not the beating of wings, something smaller, a thrumming, like a heartbeat running at the wrong speed, slightly too fast, slightly too insistent, a pulse that will not settle no matter how long you wait for it. Most people dismiss it at first, convince themselves it is exhaustion or hunger, or the ordinary anxiety of a complicated life. They are wrong, and somewhere in the part of the mind that does not lie to itself, they already know it. The Romans named the 3 primary Furies Alecto, Megaera, and Tisiphone. These names originate in Greek sources, and their Greek etymologies are not poetic flourishes. They are clinical descriptions. Diagnoses rendered in mythological language by a civilization that had no neuroscience, but possessed the most relentless observational intelligence in the ancient world, applied to the bodies of people who had done unforgivable things and subsequently deteriorated in ways that were consistent, reproducible, and specific. What the Greeks called the Three Sisters of Vengeance, a 21st century forensic psychiatrist would call a progressive psychotic break induced by guilt trauma. Same process, different vocabulary. The same screaming at the end. Alecto. In Greek, Alecto, meaning the unceasing, the endless, the thing that cannot stop. This is the first sister, and she arrives not as a figure, but as a physical state. She is not a being you see standing in the corner of the room. She is a being you feel, occupying the interior of your chest, your resting heart rate that refuses to drop below 90, the constant thrumming baseline of a body that has activated every emergency system it possesses and cannot find the signal to stand down. The cortisol that begins flooding your blood the moment you wake and does not subside when you close your eyes. The inability of the autonomic nervous system to return to its resting state. In modern clinical terms, this is severe hyperarousal, the state in which the body's threat response mechanisms are permanently activated, flooding the organs with stress hormones in anticipation of a danger that, because it originates from inside the perpetrator rather than outside, never resolves. This is where the Erinyes begin. Not with visions, not with voices, with a pulse you cannot slow, and a breath you cannot deepen, and the dawning, terrible certainty that your body has decided something is catastrophically wrong, and it has decided this forever. Megaera comes second. Her name in Greek, Megaera, translates as the grudge, the jealous rage, the one who takes offense. But what Megaera actually represents, when mapped against the clinical literature, is not rage from the outside, but paranoid ideation from within. She is the systematic conviction that the environment has become hostile, that the people standing near you are watching for signs of what you did, that the man who looked up when you entered the room did not look up because the door opened, but because he knows, that the woman who stopped talking when you approached stopped talking because she was talking about you specifically, that the shadows at the edge of the firelight are not empty space, but occupied. The research on paranoid ideation and guilt-induced psychosis is consistent. The guilty mind does not merely fear detection, it actively constructs a world in which detection is imminent. The brain, seeking resolution for an intolerable cognitive load, begins to interpret neutral stimuli as threatening. A bird landing on a branch becomes surveillance. Silence becomes accusation. Megaera is the personification of this rewiring, the moment at which ordinary sensory perception curdles into persecution, when the familiar world becomes the most dangerous place the perpetrator has ever stood. And then Tisiphone. Her name is the most explicit. In Greek, Tisiphone, the avenger of murder, the one who exacts retribution for blood spilled. But etymologically, she carries something even more specific inside her name: the destruction that comes back, the annihilation that returns to its source. Tisiphone is not an external force applied to the perpetrator. She is the moment the perpetrator's own mind turns fully against itself. She is the psychotic break, the onset of auditory and visual hallucinations so severe that the barrier between what is real and what the guilt-saturated brain is generating becomes indistinguishable. She is the moment the dreaming mind and the waking mind stop being separate compartments. Modern psychiatric literature documents this progression with clinical precision. The first stage is hyperarousal, Alecto, the nervous system refusing to settle. The second stage is paranoid ideation, Megaera, neutral reality reconstructed as hostile. The third stage is perceptual break, Tisiphone, the arrival of hallucinations so complex and immersive that the individual experiencing them cannot consistently distinguish internally generated content from external reality. After 72 hours without sleep, which the Erinyes ensure by their very presence, since they do not allow their prey to rest, the human brain begins to dream while awake. It literally starts running its nocturnal processing system in parallel with conscious perception, and the boundary between nightmare and waking dissolves like wet paper. Aeschylus understood this. In his plays, the Furies use chanting and what he calls binding songs to fracture the mind of their prey. What he was describing, in the language available to a 5th century Athenian playwright, was auditory hallucination. The victim hears voices that are not external, relentless, layered, whispering voices that replay the event they are trying not to remember, over and over, in exact detail, in the dark, when no other stimulus can compete. Modern neurophysiology explains the mechanism. It is a failure of what researchers call corollary discharge, the neural signal that the frontal speech centers send to the sensory cortex to tag incoming thoughts as self-generated rather than external. When this system misfires under extreme cognitive load, the brain cannot recognize its own internal monologue as internal. The guilt becomes a voice. The voice becomes the Furies. And the Furies are, by that point, functionally indistinguishable from the hallucinations of acute schizophrenia. The ancient Hippocratic physicians observed this collapse without understanding its mechanism, but they documented its signature with extraordinary accuracy. In the Hippocratic corpus, a Greek physician notes, with the cool clarity of someone recording a thing observed many times, that worst of all is to sleep neither by day or by night, because the patient will either be kept awake by pain and distress or will become deranged as a consequence. The Greek word used is paraphrone, to think beside oneself, to have the mind located not inside the body, but displaced slightly to one side, where it watches itself deteriorate and cannot intervene. The physical deterioration runs concurrently. The research identifies this as thoe, the ancient Greek term for wasting, associated with the kind of slow, consuming dissolution that looks from the outside like a disease eating the body from within. The mechanism is entirely internal. The perpetual cortisol flood initiated by Alecto destroys the immune system. The inability to eat destroys the body's reserves. The inability to sleep destroys the cellular repair process. The individual begins to hollow out. Sunken eyes, protruding bones, hands that tremble when raised, a face that has passed through exhaustion and arrived somewhere past it. Somewhere that does not have a civilian name. This is what the Erinyes do. This is their methodology. Not claws, not flames, not the spectacular kinetic violence of a battlefield. They take a living human being, and they use that human being's own biology as their instrument. They play the nervous system like a string instrument, tightening each string progressively until the tension becomes unbearable, and then one more turn, and one more turn, until something fundamental snaps. There is one further detail about the Erinyes' physical form that the research documents, and that the polished, romanticized depictions have systematically omitted, because it is too viscerally disturbing to survive sanitization. Aeschylus, working in the 5th century BCE, gave them their canonical physical description, and it is not the one that appears in later paintings or popular mythology. They are not beautiful women with torch and whip. They are not winged, noble agents of celestial justice. They are wingless, earthbound. They do not descend from above. They rise from below, from the ground. from the dirt. They wear robes of absolute black, garments described with the Greek word melanchimoi, meaning draped in darkness. And they are draped so completely that they function as walking voids, presences that consume light rather than reflect it. The serpents are in their hair and coiling around their limbs. The ancient Greeks believed that when the human body decomposed in the grave, the spinal cord slithered away as a snake. The Erinyes are literally wearing the rotted spines of the dead, and the snakes are moving. They do not hold torches, they do not carry scales, and their eyes weep. Not tears, Aeschylus is specific. From their eyes drips a toxic discharge of blood and mucus, a viscous, putrefying exudate that suggests their own biology is necrotizing under the weight of everything they have witnessed. They are so saturated with the horror of every crime they have ever been called to avenge that their bodies are breaking down, leaking, rotting even as they pursue the guilty across the world. They are not immortal in the sense of being immune to decay. They are immortal in the sense that they continue despite it. The rot does not stop them. It is just what they look like now. These details matter because they represent something the Greeks understood about guilt that we have carefully packaged into more comfortable forms. Guilt is not clean. It does not operate at a philosophical distance. It moves through the body's tissues like a slow contamination. It shows on the skin. It settles in the posture. It corrupts the sleep and the appetite and the immune response and the perceptual architecture. The Erinyes look the way they look because they are the visual representation of what guilt actually does to a person who cannot escape it. The only question remaining is, what specific act is sufficient to wake them? The answer has been the same since the first drops of sky blood hit the primordial earth. And the case that demonstrates it most completely is not a myth. It is a trial. Imagine you have done the right thing. Imagine you had every justification. Imagine that what you did was not only excusable, but arguably necessary, morally defensible, perhaps even heroic within the terms of the world you inhabited. Imagine that three gods, a poet, and a significant portion of an ancient audience agreed with you at the time. Now imagine the blood smell following you anyway. The story of Orestes is the story of what happens when a justified act violates a law older than justification itself. His case is not interesting because he was uniquely guilty. He is interesting because he had the best possible argument for innocence, and it did not matter. The Erinyes do not evaluate arguments. They do not weigh evidence. They respond to a single biological trigger, the smell of a mother's blood on a son's hands. To understand what Orestes did, you have to understand what was done to him first. His father was Agamemnon, king of Argos, the architect of the Greek campaign against Troy. When Agamemnon returned home victorious after 10 years of war, his wife Clytemnestra killed him in his bath. She had her reasons. Agamemnon had sacrificed their daughter Iphigenia on an altar to summon a favorable wind before sailing. He had spent a decade at war, while she managed his kingdom alone. He returned with a Trojan princess as his concubine. Clytemnestra looked at this man and killed him, and then she ruled Argos with her lover Aegisthus and lived for several years without consequences. Orestes was a child when his father was killed. He grew up in exile, shaped by that wound, trained by the god Apollo himself to return and do what the code of his world demanded: avenge the murdered father. When he came home, he killed Aegisthus, and then, in the act that catalyzes everything that follows, he killed his mother. He stood over Clytemnestra and killed her, directly, with his own hands. What happens next is documented by Aeschylus in precise, clinical detail in the libation bearers and the Eumenides. And it begins not with a vision or a voice, but with a smell. The Erinyes, in Aeschylus's text, are olfactory predators. They do not track footprints in the dirt. They track the microscopic genetic signature of spilled blood. Specifically, the blood of the closest biological relative. In the Eumenides, they announce their method directly. The scent of mortal blood smiles at me in greeting. The Greek word is osme, scent. The scent of his mother's blood, embedded in his skin at a level beneath visibility, beneath the reach of water or sand or ritual or prayer. Even after formal purification ceremonies, even after sacrificed animals and washing and the deliberate ritual erasure of the miasma, the Erinyes can still detect what remains. Because what remains is not metaphorical. It is genomic. It is the literal DNA of the woman who made him, distributed in microscopic quantities across the surface of his hands. And no amount of washing removes DNA. Orestes flees. The geography of his flight is the geography of a deteriorating mind. He moves from Argos to the sacred ground of Delphi, seeking Apollo's protection. The god of reason and order and light cannot shelter him for long. The Erinyes do not recognize Apollo's jurisdiction. They are older. They wait. He moves again to Athens, to the sanctuary of Athena's temple, to the most sophisticated city in the known world, the city that had invented democracy and philosophy and formal law. And he collapses there at the feet of Athena's statue, his body hollow, his mind cracked along multiple fault lines, running the fumes of pure will and nothing else. The research documents the specific progression, the inability to sleep, which has now been continuous long enough to produce perceptual disturbances, the inability to eat, the constant elevated heart rate that Alecto sustains in her role as the body's permanent emergency state, the paranoid reconstruction of every environment as hostile that Megaera executes, systematically, in every city he passes through. Orestes cannot stop in a tavern without feeling the walls lean toward him. He cannot rest in a field without the tall grass taking on the quality of a crowd watching. The landscape becomes complicit. The shadows become participants. Tisiphone, the final sister, the one whose name means the retribution for blood, she begins her work somewhere between Delphi and Athens. The first hallucinations arrive in the small hours, when sleep would normally come and does not. He sees them. The Erinyes themselves, shapes in the peripheral vision that vanish when he turns, shapes that do not vanish, their black robes absorbing the firelight, their blood-weeping eyes catching the dark like wet stones catching rain. He cannot establish with certainty whether they are physically present or whether his own mind is generating them from the guilt that has saturated every neural pathway. This, for the Greeks, was not a distinction worth making. The Erinyes were real. The hallucinations were real. They were the same thing. The internal and the external had already collapsed into each other, which was exactly the point. The Erinyes live in the guilty mind. The guilty mind is the only geography they need. What is remarkable about the Orestes case, the detail that makes it more than a myth and transforms it into something closer to a philosophical proposition, is the nature of his crime's ambiguity. He killed his mother. This is the act that wakes the Erinyes. But he killed his mother because she had killed his father, and the killing of a father also generates miasma, also pollutes the bloodline, also cries out for vengeance. Clytemnestra had blood on her hands, too. The logic of blood vengeance is recursive. It does not resolve. It escalates. Each act of righteous retribution generates the conditions for the next act of righteous retribution, and the Erinyes are present at every iteration, because every iteration is also a matricide, or a patricide, or a fratricide. Every righteous killing is also someone's unforgivable transgression. Orestes is haunted not because he is uniquely guilty. He is haunted because the system that generated him is guilty of its own infinite regress, and he is the one standing in the center of it when it finally becomes visible. He will reach Athens. He will find something waiting for him there that no one in the history of the world has ever tried before. An argument. A formal structure designed to contain the Erinyes within a process they cannot simply override. A room where the ancient, pre-Olympian law of blood for blood will be asked to sit quietly while 12 mortal human beings deliberate. It will not go the way anyone expects. What Athena created in Athens to contain the Erinyes is the most consequential legal innovation in the history of Western civilization. It is also, if you follow the logic all the way to its conclusion, the most disturbing one. Orestes collapses at Athena's feet, and the Erinyes follow him into her city, which is itself an act of extraordinary audacity. They are standing in the most rational, most philosophically sophisticated city that the ancient world will ever produce, and they do not care. They have no interest in sophistication. They predate it. They predate the very categories of thought that Athens considers its highest achievement. They want Orestes. They have been tracking his genetic signature across the landscape of the known world for however many months or years his flight has lasted, and they are not going to stop because a city exists. Athena intervenes, but not in the way a divine patron typically intervenes. She does not strike the Erinyes down. She does not banish them with divine force. The research is explicit on why. The Erinyes represent a primordial cosmic law that predates the Olympian order. To destroy them would be to violate the foundational architecture of justice itself, to suggest that the oldest and most absolute law in existence can simply be erased by whoever currently holds institutional power. Even Athena, goddess of wisdom, understands that this would unravel something that cannot be repaired. The alternative she invents, out of necessity, is entirely unprecedented. She invents a trial. She establishes the Areopagus, a formal homicide court, situated on a rocky hill to the west of the Acropolis. She selects 12 mortal Athenian citizens as jurors. The Erinyes, the ancient blood-hunting forces of the universe, are asked to act as the prosecution, to articulate the case for the absolute, unbending law of kinship violation. Apollo argues the defense, presenting the case for justifiable homicide, for the primacy of paternal bloodline, for the existence of intent as a mitigating factor. There are binding oaths. There are timed speeches measured by a water clock whose steady, inexorable dripping fills the room with the sound of time being rationed. The mortal jury votes. The ballots are cast in equal number for guilt and for acquittal. A perfect tie. And Athena breaks the deadlock. She votes for acquittal. Orestes is free. But the Erinyes remain, and they are furious in a way that the text conveys as something far more dangerous than ordinary divine anger. They have been stripped of their prerogative. The oldest law in existence has been overridden by a democratic process in which 12 human beings were asked to evaluate it, and found it insufficient. The Furies threaten to blight the land, to poison the soil of Attica, to make the earth sterile, the crops fail, the children come into the world dead. Because this is what the Erinyes can do when their function is obstructed. They do not merely hunt individuals, they are capable of contaminating everything. Athena negotiates. She offers them honor, permanent honor. Not dismissal, not exile, not defeat. She offers them a shrine beneath the Areopagus itself, in the earth beneath the court that just overruled them. She offers them veneration. Worship, the title Eumenides, which in Greek means the kindly ones, the gracious ones, and she offers them continued relevance. They will not vanish from the world. They will be given a place within the world's new structure. Their ancient law will not be abolished. It will be contained, managed, routed through a formal process, and given procedural form. The Erinyes accept. Now consider what this resolution actually means, because this is the moment where the ancient story stops being mythology and starts being a diagnosis of the world you currently inhabit. Humanity did not defeat the Erinyes. The verdict at the Areopagus was not a triumph over the forces of archaic blood guilt. It was a domestication. We took the raw, visceral, biological machinery of karmic retribution, the sleep deprivation and the paranoia, and the wasting and the hallucinations, and the absolute, pre-rational certainty that certain acts demand consequences. And we dressed it in robes and gave it a chamber and a calendar. The Erinyes are still here. They live beneath the foundations of every courthouse that has ever been built. They sit inside every deliberating jury. They are the force that makes a civilized human being look at the evidence of a terrible act and feel, in the body before the mind has finished processing, that something must be done, that the act cannot stand unremedied, that the world will become wrong in some structural sense if the guilty person is simply allowed to continue existing without consequence. That feeling is not civic virtue. It is not rational deliberation. It is the ancient, pre-Olympian law of blood for blood, filtered through a procedural membrane that we call justice. The prisons are the subterranean shrine. The courtrooms are built on top of the Areopagus. The judges in black robes are the Erinyes in their black melanchemoi, the pitch-dark garments that absorb light rather than reflect it. The procedural rules are the binding songs, the chants that restrain the hunt within a formal channel. And when the process fails, when a verdict is reached that violates the deep biological certainty that justice has not been served, what do people feel? They feel the Erinyes stir beneath the floorboards. They feel the law that predates the law, making itself known through the inadequacy of the law that replaced it. The ancient Greeks were not being poetic when they told this story. They were being precise. They were documenting the moment in the history of human civilization when the oldest, most brutal form of cosmic accountability was asked to wear a suit and sit at a table and submit to a process. The process was a genuine innovation, a genuine improvement over the infinite recursive spiral of blood feud. But the thing inside the process was not tamed. It was institutionalized. And institutionalization is not the same as resolution. Every time a verdict fails to satisfy the feeling in the chest that the Greeks would have called the Erinyes stirring, you are experiencing the gap between the process and the force the process was designed to contain. The kindly ones are not kind. They are managed. There is a significant difference between those two things, and the difference is where we actually live. The courthouse is built over the shrine. The polished floor of the courtroom is the ceiling of the place where the Erinyes were promised a home. And beneath the polished floor, in the dark that the procedural light cannot reach, you can hear it if you are very still. Not a roar, not a beating of wings, a thrumming, like a heartbeat running at the wrong speed, slightly too fast, slightly too insistent, a pulse that will not settle no matter how long you wait for it. Familiar. Here is the deepest irony embedded in the entire history of the Erinyes, the structural irony that the research surfaces once you follow all threads to their origin. The Eumenides, the kindly ones, the domesticated, institutionalized, proceduralized form of the Furies are more powerful than the Erinyes ever were in their wild form. The wild Erinyes could only destroy one guilty individual at a time. They hunted with intimacy and precision. One prey, one collapse, one wasting death. But the Eumenides, the version of them that inhabits legal institutions, can imprison an innocent person, can execute someone for a crime they did not commit, can generate miasma in bulk quantities at industrial scale through bureaucratic process. The Furies in their wild form were agonizing and unjust. The Furies in their institutionalized form are agonizing, unjust, and capable of processing thousands of cases per year. We did not contain the horror. We gave it infrastructure. And this is where the story stops being about ancient Greece and starts being about the feeling you have already felt, possibly more than once, standing in a room where the formal process completed correctly and the result was still, unmistakably, wrong. The verdict was delivered, the procedures were followed, the clock ran out on the speeches, and the oaths were sworn, and the ballots were counted. And the thing in your chest said, "This is not justice. It is the form of justice with the substance removed. It is the Eumenides without the Erinyes, the procedure without the old law underneath it." The ancient Greeks named the unbearable feeling. They said, "This is what happens when the kindly ones forget what they were made of." The question the whole story leaves unanswered, the question it has been building toward since the first drops of sky blood hit the earth and the first seeds of the Erinyes germinated in the dark, is one you cannot answer with a simple verdict. And you cannot answer it without implicating yourself. If you were on the jury at Orestes' trial, if you sat in the body of that first court on the Areopagus hill with the Erinyes watching from the darkness at the edges of the chamber, and Apollo arguing the logic of justification, and the water clock marking the seconds, and the ballot disc in your hand, the question of whether the oldest law in existence should yield to the newest and most ingenious process humanity had devised, knowing that your vote might tip the balance between a world governed by blood for blood and a world governed by deliberation and evidence, and the imperfect approximation of human reason. Would you have voted to acquit Orestes, acknowledging that his act was defensible within its context, but accepting that every act of justified violence generates the next generation of justified violence? Or would you have voted to convict him, upholding the absolute, pre-rational certainty that the blood of a mother calls for accountability, regardless of the circumstances, accepting that some debts cannot be negotiated away by clever arguments, and that the law beneath the law does not recognize the distinction between necessity and choice? There is a figure who never appears in the final verdict of the Oresteia, a figure who is mentioned and then left behind, abandoned in the mechanics of the plot, before anyone could ask what she might have had to say about any of this. Her name is Iphigenia. She was Orestes' sister. She was sacrificed by her father before the war began, the reason Clytemnestra's rage burned for a decade. Her blood was the first domino. Her death is the reason every subsequent death happened. She has a story that the Oresteia only partially tells. She has a perspective that no one in the courtroom at the Areopagus was asked to represent. And the Erinyes, who were born from the blood of a father wounded by his son, who have hunted every subsequent violation of blood kinship across the centuries since, were never asked whether Iphigenia's blood had called out from the earth as well, in the first seconds after the knife came down on the altar at Aulis, and what exactly they had done in response. The oldest law in existence does not forget anything. It keeps records in a language that predates language. The archive is still open.